Thank you. Hey, everyone. So my name is Parth. I work on a bunch of platform security-related issues. So my main focus is firmware. Things I've worked on lately is firmware integrity, verification, and firmware management. So the things like patching, settings management, BIOS passwords, etc. Today, we'll talk about Intel AMT, how to use it and abuse it. As a warning, I'm a Linux user, so the presentation has a natural leaning towards it. So here's what I wanted to do when I started working on this presentation. I wanted to explore the best possible attack using legitimate AMT functionality. So I want to highlight that, legitimate AMT functionality. Once I'd explored the attack, I wanted to then present my story of that attempt, all the challenges, roadblock encountered during a practical attempt, hopefully showcase the complexities involved for an attacker. You can decide how realistic this is for your scenarios, given the various nuances that you'll see. I also wanted to present all the available options for people to detect, mitigate, or prevent such attacks, and finally present a story of how to do forensics if an attack does happen. So we have quite a lot of ground to cover. Hopefully, we'll do it in an hour. Okay, in this section, we'll first start with background. What is Intel AMT? What are its core features? What are requirements for using it? How do you provision it? What does provisioning even mean? Then we'll look at quickly what AMT has been in the news lately and the open source tools that are available for using AMT. So what is AMT? It's designed to be an always available solution, even when there is no OS or even when the machine is off. The requirement is it's available as long as network and power are connected. So even if the machine's off, as long as there's power and network, it's supposed to work. AMT is implemented within the management engine, the ME. The ME runs on the chipset itself, which is separate from the main processor. Talking about the ME is a presentation in itself, so I won't go into that too much. And since the AMT is part of the ME, which is in the chipset, it's effectively hard-coded into hardware. Hopefully you can see why I call it the ghost in the machine. Although that title is probably more apt for SMM, if you've heard of that, system management mode, but that's a different story. Anyway, let's take a look at the core features of AMT. AMT allows you to do pretty much everything as if you are physically present. So power management, remote power on, off, restart, etc. You can boot off a network image, present it as a CD-ROM or a floppy drive to the system. So the ME, which is in the chipset, will present a fully emulated IDE CD-ROM drive to the system. So the OS thinks it's a physically plugged-in CD drive. Using the remote floppy, we can actually even exfil data. So I did that testing. I mounted a large floppy, which is a gig, 1 GB of floppy drive. You know, the different sizes here. The KVM, so you can observe or take control of a keyboard, video, mouse, as if you are physically present again. This requires the display to be connected to the integrated GPU, so which is usually the case for laptops. Desktops depends if you have a separate GPU card. Serial over LAN, similar to the CD-ROM, a serial port is emulated by the ME. This has many use cases. One core usage for managing BIOS. So since most modern BIOSes allow redirecting the screen to serial, so you can reboot the BIOS, redirect it to serial, and then if you're remote, you can now see the BIOS and manage it. One of the most interesting features is the client-initiated remote access, or CIRA. One use case is a user is off-site, can initiate remote help at boot time. It will work with a broken OS or even with no OS. So the idea is for AMT to connect to an admin server when you're off-premise and create a tunnel for the support personnel to come back through. So this way you can bypass NAT or wherever, it doesn't matter where you're in the world, you connect out to an admin server and you have a tunnel now. CRI tunnel can also be set to auto-dial at specified times for checking in centrally. So this could be to check in for new settings, or it could be to make sure the laptop has not been marked as stolen. So you can dial out, check with your admin server, is everything okay? Everything's okay? Okay, people can continue to use the laptop. So hopefully you've got a good idea of the core AMT capabilities. Next, what are the requirements for having it on your laptop or desktop? So there are 3 steps for being able to use AMT remotely. First is manufacturer decision. Second is BIOS setting, basically an on and off setting in the BIOS menu. And the last is AMT setup itself. So because of manufacturer decision, AMT is not present in most consumer devices. So from my understanding, the ME module and the AMT module cost extra for manufacturers in licensing fees. So they don't include them in consumer devices. But most business desktops or laptops usually come with AMT as an add-on. And it's usually enabled in the BIOS by default. Some of the more beefier spec consumer devices also come with AMT as an add-on feature. Just because it's enabled in the BIOS doesn't mean it's usable. It has to be provisioned for it to be usable. What does provisioned mean here? It means to activate any of the AMT interfaces for usage. To do that, you need to do a bunch of bare minimum settings that must be set, and the process of setting those settings is called provisioning. And what those settings are depends on how you provision it, the method which we'll talk about next. So let's take a look at the provisioning options, the methods you can use to provision an AMT. So generally speaking, there are 4 broad ways you can provision AMT for usage, and there are 2 provisioning modes once the provisioning is done. The provisioning mode ACM or CCM is meant to reflect the level of trust required to complete the setup process. So ACM admin control mode, CCM client control mode. Note that all of these kind of intermingle and can be used in combination with each other. So try not to think of them as distinct options. These are just, as I'll mention in a second. So local agent.os, for example, the first one, requires Intel AMT software to be installed and running as root or admin on the box. You can do this via your own custom tool as well. In that case, you obviously need admin privileges, and you talk to the Intel ME interface to be able to provision AMT. This method will put you in client control mode, which will give you limited AMT functionalities. You can carry out additional steps to transition into admin control mode, but that's a bit more involved, but doable. The second option, the remote option, requires pre-setup at factory or via USB to be enabled. So in that case, what happens is AMT will send hello packets on AMT LAN for up to 6 hours after first boot. The very first time a machine is turned on, for up to 6 hours, it will send hello packets. Then it will turn off. That time period is configurable just up to 24 hours usually. So it's not a big security flaw. The responding server that responds to the hello certificates must present a certificate that's pre-trusted by AMT. And the trust certificate is configurable as well, again, either at factory or with a USB key. Third option is USB. In that case, you put a setup.bin file on a FAT32 USB and configure AMT with it. And this includes you can configure the certificates that are trusted as well. So again, like I said, that things kind of intermingle. You can use them with each other. And finally, provision can be done physically via the BIOS menu. This is 10 easy-to-follow steps that can be carried out in about 30 seconds. Note that these methods can be used to set further options even after provisioning is technically complete. The line between provisioning versus configuration is a little blurry. To be exact, provisioning can be considered completed as soon as AMT exposes any of its 2 interfaces for usage. So the AMT has 2 interfaces, local and remote. And this usually happens as soon as you change the default password. So AMT has a default password, which is admin. As soon as you change it, AMT's mostly provisioned. It starts listening for API calls. Once provisioning is complete, you can access the full set of options and features via the AMT APIs. But you can still use one of these options to set some other settings. It's a bit weird the way it works. But anyway, that's enough on provisioning. AMT in the news, maybe some of you have already heard of this. A couple of quick mentions. First, we have the Intel SA75, escalation of privilege vulnerability. In short, this is May, I think it's from May this year. In short, it was, or maybe it was earlier. In short, it was HTTP digest auth for AMT could be bypassed with a null or empty response. So you just say, I don't have a password for you, and it goes, okay, you're in. AMT, in that case, to exploit that, obviously AMT needs to be provisioned, and an attacker needs to be on the same network to be able to exploit it. So it's kind of two mitigating factors there. A patch is available, so if you haven't patched, you may want to do that. But if you don't have a computer, if you don't have a lab or you're at work, you don't have everything that's actually provisioning AMT, then it may not be so bad for you. Second thing is the Platinum there. So malware developed by the Platinum group was seen hiding communication from OS by using the serial over LAN that I mentioned earlier. So we're using serial over LAN in order to bypass local monitoring on the OS. So a lot of times you have OS level monitoring for network packets, and they were using serial over LAN via AMT so that it couldn't be seen. Nice way to exfiltrate data. Now, is there more to come here in this space? I think there is. So there is an ME talk scheduled at Black Hat London, probably in a month or so, and it sounds promising. Finally, in this section, for the background section, here's some quick notes on the tools that are available. Everything is actually in one convenient central place. I used both of these as well as the older Mesh Central for my attack in the next slides. It's all open source. It's actually mostly developed by Intel employees. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so let's go back to looking for the best practical attack using Intel AMT. Now we know a little bit about AMT itself. So when I started this exercise, this is what I wanted to achieve. Obviously, when I started, I didn't know if this was really possible. It seemed likely from the documentation. That's why I started exploring the idea. So my goal was to A, control AMT, B, maintain persistent access, and C, remain stealthy in the process. So before we proceed to try achieve those goals, just one quick slide on what we can do afterwards. Assume we've achieved that, what can we do next? So just so you can see an end-to-end goal here. I didn't actually carry any of these out, but since it's nothing specific to AMT. This is not specific to AMT, it's just general exercise. So if you're a standard attacker, once you have AMT control, you can use it to restart the machine, boot your own disk, then replace, if the disk is encrypted, then you can replace the unencrypted boot parts to hijack disk encryption password. Come back a few days later, use the encryption password to replace binaries on disk, and get the machine to connect back to your CNC, and then you basically have root now. Anyone with repeated physical access to your machine today can do this. With the difference with AMT is you can do it with potentially just one-off physical access. The reason I put down easy to hard in the difficulty is because the success here depends on a few factors, such as if you have secure boot and or trusted boot being used. Even if some or all of those are being used, how the BIOS is protected also contributes. We'll touch on it again when we talk about mitigations later on. As a sophisticated attacker, you can use AMT to restart machine to your own boot disk again, but at this time you can insert system management mode backdoor into the flash chip itself. Since we have root in the box, we can talk to the flash chip. This is not as universal as the previous attack, standard attack, because most machines severely lock down right into the BIOS region. So that usually complicates your life. Now, did I miss a scenario here? What would you do if you had AMT control on someone's machine? So you can tell me right at the end. Question time. All right. So let's explore our first aim of getting AMT control. What are our options for provisioning AMT on a target machine? So option A, we can subvert the supply chain. The complexity is high. You can say this is medium, depends on how you define it. Likely attacker is highly resourced attacker, casting a wide net or targeting someone. Provisioning method, anything. You have physical access to the machine. You can root remote setup, you can do USB, you can do BIOS menu, whatever you like. The medium, you can say medium here if you think maybe you'll attack someone who's posted their laptop and the laptop's been left unattended on the street for an hour or so and you'll grab it or something. I mean, it depends on what you define as subverting supply chain. Second option is you can have root or admin on the machine already. In this case, the provisioning method will be local agent on the OS. The complexity is high for a well-secured OS at least, or medium if you think getting root on a box is easy. Another reason for high is because provisioning via local agent will get you client control mode and not admin control mode. The likely attacker here, again, is a sophisticated attacker looking for long-term persistence. Because if you already have root on the box, you kind of wonder why you want AMT. Both of these are hard to carry out and unlikely for different reasons. The last one, physical access, seems the easiest to me. So complexity is low. Likely attacker is someone who's targeting you or opportunistic. Could be evil-made type attack or shipment interception. The provisioning method here is either USB or BIOS menu. So you're assuming you don't have root on the box. You can't log into the machine. Let's tweak our goals because I think physical access seems the most likely, most easiest to proceed. So easiest attack vector requires physical access, so desktops are excluded, assuming that desktop facilities are well secured. Laptops also travel and get left unattended. I assume you go out and drink and you leave your laptop in the hotel. So it seems realistic. I've written Lenovo X1 Carbon 2016 here as the target machine, but I've also tested this on other machines. Okay, let's talk about some assumptions so we know what our base is. Firstly, obviously the machine we target has to have AMT. Next, Intel AMT should not have been provisioned already. Some BIOSes allow unprovisioning from the BIOS menu, but others do not. So if the BIOS doesn't have a password, then an attacker can go into the BIOS and unprovision the AMT and then reprovision it with their own password. Thirdly, the MEBX password, which is also known as the ME password, should still be the Intel default, which is admin. This is usually the case. If you buy in large enough quantity, you can ask the manufacturer to change this to something else. But unless you're going to use AMT, why would you do it, right? Finally, either AMT should already be enabled or a BIOS password is not set, so we can enable AMT ourselves. So observation here is HP will not let you enter the AMT setup BIOS menu without the BIOS password, but Lenovo will. Hence why it's not a requirement for our attack. Lenovo is what I used. Okay. So here's an ideal attack scenario. Look for an opportunity or create a distraction. Then, since we'd like to spend as little time as needed to provision and set up USB, AMT, we'll use USB to auto-provision AMT, and then set up AMT to auto-start a CRA session to call out to my command and control server. And we should be good. That's it. That's what the documentation says should work. Let's see what really happened. So this is the ideal. Do this, walk away. Unfortunately, there was a few hiccups. So here's what I found trying to do this. So USB provisioning file can be really easily created using the open source software I already mentioned. The USB provisioning worked even when it shouldn't, when it seemed it shouldn't work. So these cases are like, it worked even when there was a BIOS password set. It worked even when I had disabled always on USB. It worked even when I had removed USB from the boot priority order. It just worked. It just always worked. But the downside was I could only set a very limited number of settings via USB. And the one setting I could not set that I really wanted to set was CRA. But what I could set through USB was a remote provisioning server, which what it does is that AMT will call out to a remote provisioning server and ask for more settings, which could include CRA. But I can't set up CRA directly. So this makes life a little more complicated than I wanted, but that's what I was stuck with. So I had a couple of options to get Sierra to work. So option A, set provisioning server via USB and use that, the provisioning server, to push the Sierra settings I wanted. Firstly, the provisioning server will have to be on the same network. Won't work on an external network because response to hello packets won't be received by AMT without a Sierra tunnel, which is what I want to set. So we'll need to bring along a Raspberry Pi or something similar running the provisioning server. Secondly, there is no easy-to-use Linux software for the provisioning server, and I don't want to write one. The open source tooling that I mentioned earlier is being actively developed, and they are going to add this functionality at some point. So I didn't want to double up the effort. So option B, manual setup through LAN. So this increases attack timing. In this case, once AMT is configured via a USB, I would connect the laptop's LAN to my own network and use AMT API calls to set up Sierra. Because once AMT is provisioned, I have full API access. This adds about 30 seconds to the attack if API calls are pre-scripted. Can up to about or 3 minutes if you do this via nice GUI. So there's a video from Mesh Central developer on YouTube titled Mesh Central 2 Intel AMT Sierra. It's a perfect title, and it shows you exactly how you can do it using GUI. I ended up going with option B, which is easier for now. I didn't want to rewrite what they're going to write anyway. In both cases, though, you need either a built-in LAN or a native LAN adapter. So let's update our assumption slide. So for our attack, the machine needs to have either built-in LAN or native LAN adapter, which AMT will use to listen by default. USB LAN adapter will not work, since AMT doesn't listen to it by default. So for the X1 Carbon that I was using, it doesn't have built-in LAN, but it has a custom LAN adapter. So you can buy this little adapter, it plugs in, and it's seen as native by the OS and by the system, and then AMT listens to it anyway. So it worked out for me. And for my quick research, I think generally speaking, business laptops either generally have LAN or have an adapter like the X1 to allow for LAN, because they usually like dockable stations. So this still seems like an acceptable list of assumptions to me. Okay, so attack steps. Set up USB, set up command and control server, write AMT Sierra script, bring LAN adapter and cable. Execution is reboot, plug in USB, plug in the LAN cable and adapter, trigger script to set up Sierra, and then walk away. Results. Here we're connected into the laptop via Sierra. We can see that Sierra is set up. It is configured to dial out to my server every 10 seconds and maintain a persistent tunnel forever as soon as the connection is established. So it'll keep trying every 10 seconds depending on if the internet is up or not. And as soon as it's established, it will stay connected so that I can tunnel back in. That's how I'm looking at the screen. In Mesh Central 2, here you can see, takes care of the rest. I don't really have to do anything advanced. I even configured Sierra to dial out over Wi-Fi in case LAN is down. In this screenshot, I'm connected to AMT via Sierra tunnel, which was established over Wi-Fi. So you can see wireless link is up, wired link is down. I also tested KVM over the Sierra tunnel. This was tested over LAN only though. Doing this over Wi-Fi without an OS agent or helping a Wi-Fi driver is a bit complicated. The way it's meant to work is AMT would hand back control of Wi-Fi radios to the OS whenever the Wi-Fi driver is loaded. In the normal use case, the Wi-Fi driver is meant to pass the messages between AMT and the OS, or an OS agent is meant to take over. I didn't try this as we didn't assume having that level of access from the beginning because we need kind of root access to be able to load our drivers. But as an attacker, you can load the correct driver or agent once you have control. So once you have AMT control, then you can load the correct drivers. Or you can load your own custom OS which has the correct driver. Some of the other some functionality I did not test, so remote mounting and booting the disk through Mesh Central. It's not implemented yet. Again, it's active development, so just I'll wait a bit and it'll show up. I did test that independently, as I mentioned earlier. I mounted a floppy drive and exfilled some data just for the fun of it. So Wi-Fi is a bit of a limit. So AMT seems to be most useful when the machine is connected to LAN. Some people do use laptop docks via LAN, but it's not significantly reliable. As mentioned before, Wi-Fi control is handed to OS when the Wi-Fi driver loads. But the loaded driver, which comes with Windows, may be the correct one by default. Again, also, to use Wi-Fi, the profiles for Wi-Fi must be loaded into AMT. So AMT supports up to 16 Wi-Fi profiles. The attacker needs to know which local APs are likely to be available and know the credentials, passwords or certs to connect to them. So if you're surrounded by well-known APs, then you should care about this a bit more. The boot injection attack I mentioned earlier, the standard attacker, is still possible over Wi-Fi. When you boot your custom OS, you have two choices. Either don't load any Wi-Fi driver, so the the radio's control isn't handed over to the OS, or load the correct driver and then connect out through that. So either way is fine. So as long as a driver doesn't try to take control of the radios, AMT will keep working. For a full list of limitations with Wi-Fi, there is a doc titled Key Differences Between Wired and Wireless Intel AMT Support, so you can check that out if you want to know more. Hopefully you've got a fair idea of what's involved of using AMT for an attack, despite the Wi-Fi limitations. It definitely seems like something to be worried about since it has such powerful, legitimate features. This concludes the attacker-focused side of the presentation. Next, what can us defenders do? It's kind of what I do generally, defend. Let's look at options we have for detection, mitigation, and prevention. First up, how do we detect when an attacker is abusing the ghost of the machine? So, two options. Network-based, look for well-known network ports. So remote configuration and provisioning request always call out to TCP 9971. Which is hard-coded into the ME. So you can look for that on your network, for example. Source ports for AMT-initiated packets, for example, SIRA, are always between 16992 and 16995. So these are the ports that are reserved for AMT and are hard-coded into the ME. They cannot be changed by anyone. And the reason for this is because the way the AMT listens to API calls or listens to anything sent to it is by hijacking the network adapter directly. So if every packet that goes through a network adapter gets looked at by the AMT, and if it matches this port, it gets grabbed before the OS sees it. So you can't just listen to all ports because then the OS won't get any packets. So these ports are hard-coded for a good reason. SIRA connections can be mutual TLS, but they're always at least TLS. So for SIRA, the way it works is server public key is inserted into AMT at setup time, like I mentioned earlier, either via USB or at factory. AMT will then generate a certificate, the private key of which can never be exported. And the server will use that certificate on the command and control side to establish trust. And whenever SIRA is running, all inbound network ports are closed, so you can't probe AMT. But if the attacker is not using SIRA, you can do a AMT port scan and it will respond to 16992. The problem here is, can you really distinguish between AMT traffic and OS traffic if it's all mutual TLS? Most modern OSs hopefully shouldn't reuse AMT ports because they're reserved, so you should never see OS traffic coming from them. So this is, detection likelihood here is possible in my opinion. And the second option you can do is have an OS agent running on your OS. So the OS agent can talk to the ME interface and then query the state of the AMT and say, hey, is this enabled? Is this provisioned? And if it's provisioned, then you can have a signal. If the attacker already controls the OS when your agent is running, then they could fake the response. So the tool needs to be deployed prior to OS compromise. So if it's deployed at reimage time, for example, then you're good. For Windows, this is not too hard because there's existing tooling that Intel has made available. For Linux, it's a bit of effort because you need to write some custom tooling. As an aside, I did a network capture of the CRS sessions using a physical network tap that was sitting between the Lenovo laptop and the LAN, just to see how it worked, and I confirmed the mutual TLS connection. I had no idea what was going on. There's also the possibility of detection by user. So custom OS boot can be seen by a user. Windows Tray app IMSS will show pop-up whenever AMT is provisioned or any AMT-related action is performed. This app is sometimes installed by default by manufacturers, but obviously enterprises that roll their custom build probably remove it, so it depends. Obviously unknown if users will even notice or understand what the little pop-ups mean. So again, it may work in your favor, may not. And finally, as you can see with the screenshot, KVM, if you do a KVM, it'll always display an animated sprite on screen to warn the user. This cannot be disabled. But on the other hand, if you're an advanced attacker, you will probably try and do this when the user is asleep. So hopefully they won't notice. But the possibility remains for you. Mitigations. What can you do to mitigate such types of attacks? So the ideal is you have a verified boot chain, you bind the hard drive encryption keys against correct TPM PCR values, and you have remote attestation. How does the verified boot chain help? You can't replace the bootloader with a malicious bootloader because the machine would no longer boot and unlock the hard drive. So the user will notice that someone's booted a custom OS and replaced bits on their disk. The reason it's achievable for Windows is because Secure Boot is supported and BitLocker is available, which uses TPM. Making sure it's set up correctly is a different problem though, especially for enterprises. For example, BIOS passwords don't exist on most laptops. So Secure Boot can be disabled by an attacker. Using AMT, right? You can boot into the BIOS, disable Secure Boot. But TPM-bound hard drive encryption won't be bypassed. And the user will be notified by being asked for a recovery key, for example. Whether the user, how the user reacts really depends on your enterprise. Existing mitigations that already exist is not many people use LAN regularly on their laptop. Enterprises that only allow internet access through a proxy will be saved, as Sierra won't work via proxy. So if all your internet must go through a proxy, then Sierra won't work. With using KVM, attackers can try avoid using KVM when they think people might be using the machine at night, but like as I mentioned, there's always a possibility of discovery. All right, what about, finally, how do you prevent all such attacks altogether? Buy machines without AMT. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as it sounds because buying for an enterprise is complicated because mostly highly spec machines come with AMT by default. So you either downgrade your machine or you put up with AMT. Second option is you can control the AMT. So you get in there yourself first, provision the AMT, and once it's provisioned and a BIOS password is set, then you're good. This is also a lot of work because you need to kind of sign up for enterprise rollout and management. So depending on how big your enterprise is, this could become a nightmare. And the last option is disable AMT. And set up BIOS password so that an attacker cannot re-enable it. Now, lots of vendors and tooling means there's no easy way to do this for a whole fleet. So if you have a fleet of thousands of machines with different vendors, different OSs, you're in a bad spot, and that's kind of where we are. It hasn't been standard practice to request the ability to control all of these settings from the OS. So the tooling that exists is sparse and sort of works sometimes, sort of doesn't work, and there's no standard. As an aside, there's a fourth option specifically for Lenovo because the BIOS has a setting called permanent disable AMT. I didn't try it because I have no idea what will happen. But it's, yeah. Now, the setting the BIOS password, again, is a related problem to setting the AMT disabled on a whole fleet. You don't want the same password on your whole fleet because your effectiveness is kind of reduced. If it leaks, then the attacker knows it. So what you really want is unique passwords per machine. So password management, it feels like the 90s, but that's where the BIOSes are. So in short, the two real options you have is to either take control yourself or disable AMT and set a BIOS password. Finally, obviously need to make sure that the BIOS actually respects the disable choice, the disable setting. There was a bug with Lenovo. They have a security advisory out from last year where AMT was set to disabled, but the USB provisioning still worked. So manufacturers fixing bugs, hopefully. All right, so hopefully you understand the options you have available as a defender. What about if you're an incident responder? What if someone takes over AMT on your machine and you somehow detect it? What forensics options do you have? De-chipping is an option, but it's not very scalable. Remember, the ME is within the chipset, so you could de-chip. But if you have to do this on a large scale, it's going to get very expensive very quickly. The AMT API, without knowing the admin password, is useless. And since the attacker has gotten before you, you don't have the admin password. Of course, we can try the auth bypass vulnerability I mentioned, assuming you haven't patched it already. But you should have patched it, right? So what are your real options? The way I explored this is through reality, where a plugin I had written for an internal network scan at Google detected a provisioned AMT during one of the regular scans. And admin password unknown, and when I talked to the owner, he said, I don't know what this is. So we had found an AMT that was provisioned, and we didn't know how to get into it. So that's how this whole slide deck happened. So some due diligence first. A colleague of mine checked network logs for everyone who ever talked to any of the AMT ports on that machine. Answer was all internal, known IPs and people, nothing to worry about. I collected a BIOS dump using GER. So GER is Google's incident response tool. It's open source. So it allows you to, so it has a functionality that we coded last year to collect BIOS dumps from Linux machines. So I collected a BIOS dump and verified that by matching it against the official BIOS that I obtained from the vendor and taking them both apart using UFI extract. That's actually the project that I spent most of my time on last year. This AMT stuff has been mostly side work for me. Anyway, the results of that comparison was all good. I didn't see anything that would look bad. The BIOS is matched. Nothing to worry about, right? Things look good enough to close, but you have this nagging feeling of, well, how did this get provisioned if nothing suspicious has ever happened? So I reached out to the AMT team and asked how I could do forensics. I had a quick meeting and found out that no one had asked about this before. I was pointed to a Windows tool, which can be used to generate a status report of AMT. I asked about Linux since the lab machine we detected was running Linux. and I didn't want to boot Windows specifically for just this. But they don't have a Linux team anymore, so there's nothing for Linux. And the admin tool that I did test just said AMT was provisioned, and I said, I know. So this is what I wanted: a Linux tool and full AMT audit log. So AMT has built-in functionality that logs everything you do with it. Amazing, nice. The log can be cleared by an admin, but when you clear the log, it leaves the log entry saying someone cleared it. So as long as I can get to this log, hopefully I can see if someone did something. But without an admin password, I have zero access. What I actually got was the Windows tool, and as I said, it just told me the AMT was provisioned and how it was provisioned. It's interesting, but not enough, in my opinion. So I spent some time observing the Windows tool and how it worked, poking at it. I found out that it was calling get local system account via the ME interface. The ME interface is exposed by a driver that interfaces with the Intel ME. What I learned was there is a built-in AMT user called $OS admin, which has limited access. And this get local system account retrieves the password for that user. The password is randomly generated at each boot, max once every 24 hours. And that account cannot be disabled, and the password cannot be controlled. That user doesn't have anywhere near the same level of access as the admin user. It's meant to be used for the OS, for local provisioning. So this is how, when you have an OS agent and you try and do a local provisioning, it uses this user to set up, move to client control mode. So I set about replicating this to Linux. Thankfully, the ME interface driver is already in Linux mainline. So dev/dev/MEI is where you can talk to the ME interface. You need IOCTL to talk to it. I wrote some quick Python hack to retrieve the credentials. Doing IOCTL using Python was not one of my best moments. I was very desperate for a solution at that time. So this whole process from start to end took 2 weeks, and I was getting more and more desperate the more I was trying to figure out what was happening with this machine. I managed to get the password for the OS admin account, but it didn't work. I read a bit more, and one of the limitations of the admin account is also that it only works locally. So using the credentials to call the AMT API over network doesn't work, which seems like a good security measure. But the OS, if you remember earlier, can't talk to the AMT directly because the network packets are stolen directly off the hardware adapter by AMT. So when you try and talk via the OS through the loopback address, the OS never touches hardware, and so therefore AMT never sees those packets. So you somehow have to get to hardware from locally. So this is where it gets fun. So what next? I found out that what I needed was the local manageability service here. So what it does is it exposes all the AMT network ports to localhost. And it's done via the ME interface through some other APIs. So obviously this software is available for Windows, nothing for Linux. Well, actually nothing for Linux. It was open sourced a few years ago, but not maintained. But I was able to use it with a few minor adjustments and proceed. So, retrieving AMT audit log. Building the local manageability service on Linux required minor fixes. Patch for getting it to build is part of the repository that's being open sourced here. The bugs were pretty minor, but I didn't have anywhere to report them since it's not really maintained. It's just a zip file on a website, not a Git repo. I did eventually succeed in dumping the full audit log using the creds through LMS. So the way it worked was I ran my Python hack, which got me the password for the $OS admin account. Then I started the LMS service, and then I talked to that LMS service, and I supplied the username and password, and now I was able to make the API calls. And then now I can make the API call to retrieve the AMT audit log. Thankfully, the AMT audit log was readable by that user. I didn't have to be admin. So the audit log records that I did get were base64 encoded. The decoding the string revealed it seemed mostly garbage, mostly because I could see words like admin. So there was some kind of a struct here that I didn't understand. There were some ASCII readable words and some structs. No public documentation on what that base64 string was. So Google failed me. I continued digging. I think I had a few more meetings, and then eventually I got desperate and I started reading the AMT SDK. So AMT SDK is a massive zip. I think it's 200 megs. It's meant to contain sample code for all API calls. I was hoping to find hints on parsing the audit log records. So I unzipped it and I went egrep-r audit log. Bad idea. Hundreds and hundreds of matches. I think I spent at least 2-3 days just digging through the AMT SDK. 4 layers of indirection later, I did eventually found the struct, but it was called something very generic. It had nothing to do with the AMT audit log. But the reference for that struct is in the repository I'm open sourcing, so you don't have to spend the same amount of time. And getting those structs to decode was actually also very painful because the field lengths within the structs were being used to indicate whether the next field existed. So the Python script that I wrote to decode from base64 into the structs and into something readable, which is being open source, is quite painful, as you'll see. So findings. This is the screenshot of the actual audit log from the machine that took 2 weeks away from me. According to inventory, Google received this machine on the 27th of September 2016. But according to the audit log and the provisioning record, the AMT was set up on the 23rd of January 2015. So factory mistake, shipment interception, but nothing suspicious in the audit log. The audit log matched the network logs that we already tried. So the external network logs matched the audit log from within the AMT. AMT logged every login attempt that it had seen, and the IPs, everything matched. So everything is good, right? Safe to close the investigation. This is as far as you go. I still had the nagging feeling of, well, still it doesn't explain the full story, right? Like we have a year gap. How did we get a machine shipped to us that was provisioned 1 year before we received it? So since we never want to leave any leaves unturned, I emailed the machine vendor asking for history before we received it at Google. 26 emails, and 2 more weeks later, we find out the machine was actually received in 2013. But it was received as part of a Linux test lab where they were testing the hardware to make sure that we could use it. Therefore, it was not part of standard inventory. And the way they used it in the test lab was by setting up AMT and doing remote installs. And on the 27th of September, 2016 is when it was no longer needed in the lab and it was moved to normal inventory pool, and then it was lent out to someone else. And during that process, the AMT was not disabled. And that's what my network scan picked up. So at the end, it turned out to be 4 weeks of waste for nothing. The lesson for next time was actually inventory is hard. So next time when I have this case, first thing I do is track down where the machine's been first, because it probably was part of the Linux test lab. Anyway, that concludes my forensic story. Since writing this presentation, here's new things that I've learned from Intel. Micro LMS is an alternative to LMS. The source and Windows standalone binaries available, so these are actually quite small. Mesh Commander has a save all state option, which is useful from a forensics perspective. You can make all API calls to AMT and save it, and then you can look through it yourself later on and try and figure out if that gives you some more info. And Intel is also now looking at exposing the audit log directly via the ME interface without needing username and password to access it. Okay, one quick slide on this. Recovery, what are your options after compromise and forensics is done? So you did have a real compromise, you have finished forensics. Now what do you do? How do you recover the machine? Depends. So without knowing the admin password, you cannot unprovision programmatically. With the $OS admin account, it does not have enough rights to unprovision. So it really depends on the vendor. If they have a BIOS menu option to unconfigure AMT or not. If they don't, then I guess you have to reach out to them and ask for something. Unfortunately, I was hoping that you could do something here, but unfortunately there isn't. Okay, so finally, in short, we can say that attacking using AMT is possible. Detection and prevention is difficult, although mitigation is achievable. And lastly, forensics is reliable. So what I found with forensics, even though it was frustrating, I had a high level of trust in what I got back. As a takeaway, I would highly recommend going through my suggestions from the detection, mitigation, prevention slides to see which of them you can apply for your own personal or company situation. So things to look at is detection, network or OS level, mitigation, so start working on verified boot. It will help with other attack vectors too, not just AMT. And lastly, prevention, so either provision AMT yourself or disable AMT, set BIOS password, or don't buy AMT machines. Thank you for listening. If you have any thoughts on what I can do next, I'm happy to hear.
So, thank you, Parth. If anyone has any questions? We have to do this quick, so we can set up the next session.
Oh, well, thanks for your talk. Just maybe a naive question. If you hijack the AMT, can you modify the code of the AME that's outside the AMT? And in particular, can you modify the code that SGX will rely on, like the trusted counter and the...
Not through the AMT, no. So the ME code is signed, so and the AMT doesn't give you any control, any API calls, no legitimate API calls exist to let you talk to the ME.
So there's no way to subvert SGX if you control the AMT?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
One more question?
You can always ask me later.
Yeah. Last question and we'll move.
So you mentioned that you can, for example, provision your own server and as a mitigation factor. So how does AMT store like variable settings or everything? Is it possible, for example, for me to dump the SPI and replace like password hashes, or I don't know, replace the server so it would point to my own? If I have physical access, is it possible for me to replace those things or not?
So that's actually a multi-layered question. So variables are stored as part of the ME settings, and that's an encrypted image. You can reverse engineer it, but there's no easy way to do it if you dump the SPI flash. So as a setting itself, you can change that easily. You don't have to go to the SPI flash level, right? Through the BIOS menu, you can just change it. As in the server itself, the web server itself, as in the code of it, replacing it, again, it's not really legitimately possible. So unless you find a vulnerability that allows you to bypass the encryption checks that ME does. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Parth. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.